Hello, everyone. And today isn't really, it's a little different from my other uploads. It's not a shit post and it's not me reporting on the news in the gaming industry. It's actually just a little bit of a rant about a subject that I personally am quite invested in and quite interested in. So I got the initial idea to talk about this after reading a certain article over the weekend, which was in response to a Twitter post. Now I know what you're thinking. Wow, an article written about a Twitter post, that sounds quite riveting. No, the subject of this particular Twitter post was specifically blaming historical gaming, so games like Sid Meier's Civilization, for example, partly for the rise of right-wing thought in specifically young Western men. And I feel it kind of partly aligns with some of my own views about it, and really leads to the thesis statement of kind of the video that I've got here, which is that as someone who is incredibly interested in video games, but also incredibly interested in history, I kind of have to tell you that games' capacity to teach history, at least in the form of strategy games, is genuinely really quite limited for reasons that I'm going to go into now. So if you go into any kind of historical discussion online, especially on websites like Twitter or Reddit or YouTube comments, it really doesn't matter what kind of discussion you're having. The history understanders will always log on and they will always tell you what they, how they do things. The great example is I would be severely skeptical of anyone that could say that a certain German politician from the early to mid 20th century could have won a World War II. We won't name him. I'll call him Adolf Hitler. So yeah, anyone that logs on and says, "Oh yeah, well here Adolf Hitler could have won the war. Here's how," I all but guarantee this person is a Hearts of Iron player, for example. Kind of one of the things that people don't realize is that ultimately when you're looking at these historical strategy games, it could be Civilization, it could be Hearts of Iron, it could be Total War. I mean, this could be fucking Risk or Diplomacy. Ultimately, these are games, right? So what do I mean by that? Do I mean that means that they're not worthy of academic observation? No, that's not what I mean. What I mean is that they are using historical contexts, but they are wrapping them up in the language of play, right? The language of a strategy game. Consider, what is a strategy game? A strategy game is a set game with a specific set of rules, and as part of that, it means that there will be certain abstractions that are made, certain things that are quantified that couldn't be quantified otherwise. And the thing is that what a lot of people miss about these is history is not that clean. When you look at any kind of historical conflict, things are significantly a lot messier than that. What decides whether or not one nation will win a war versus another nation losing a war? Let's look at the Second World War again in particular. If I'm looking at a World War II simulation game and I go in with the understanding that the Axis powers are basically pretty much set to lose the war the second they started, that is not very engaging for me as a player for either side. Because as with real life, did the German state and the Japanese Empire, did they do a lot of damage? Did they have some really impressive territorial conquests? Yes, they did. However, they were also coming into conflict with the Soviet Union and America, and that means that they were fucked. All right, there's no other word for it. They were fucked. There is no fucking timeline where Germany wins World War II. Anyone who's saying otherwise, like I said, is a Hearts of Iron player, or they're a neo-Nazi who's huffing weapons-grade copium. There's no other... There's no other difference. Okay. And the other thing as well is that the language of games can really taint how we view history. One thing that you'll find from a lot of historical nerd weirdos is they get very focused on statistics. And again, a lot of the time, this is because they are used to looking at statistics in games. You know, let's say that you're playing War Thunder or you're playing World of Tanks or something like that. Some kind of World War II tank game, okay? In the language of the game, there are things you pay attention to and there are things that you don't. In the context of a video game, I am paying attention to how big my gun is, how thick my armor is, things like that. You know, the combat capability of a tank. And if you engage with history on that level, purely the statistical level, then you'll be tempted to think that German engineering, or for example, you know, some of the really heavy Panzers and the Tigers and what have you, were the best tanks in the conflict. What World of Tanks and what War Thunder are not teaching you, however, is that you can have the heaviest tank in the world. It won't do you any good if it can't get ball bearings, it can't get fuel, and the Americans and the Russians can field 100 more tanks than what you can put out. And that's how this kind of stuff gets affected, right? Unfortunately, for the vast majority of games, they don't reflect the fact that there are three major components to war which really decide a conflict above anything else. One is logistics, one is politics, and the other is diplomacy. Unfortunately, if you're engaging in a game where the primary modes of interacting with that game world are conquest, or just shooting guys in the face, those are not conducive to that. Okay, so, you know, I've been going very hard on the World War II examples, but there's another way where abstraction for abstraction's sake can be quite harmful to the understanding of history as well, and this is actually to circle back to the game that the article was focusing on, which was Civilization. And I think probably one of the main issues that Civilization has is a lot of people got held up about the victory conditions in Civilization, right? So they say, oh, well, you can win Civilization without engaging in conquest, for example. You know, you can engage in a science victory or an economic victory or a cultural victory. Again, Civilization is a game, right? And it is a game that depicts competition between civilizations. And this is kind of problematic for a couple of different reasons. So the first is what is a civilization? Okay, now this is a philosophical discussion that is a little beyond the scope of this video. But for example, I want to raise to you, how would you define a British civilization, for example? So, you know, like if you're unfamiliar with the Civilization games, what happens is at the start of the game, you pick a nation, you play as that nation, and you progress through human history from prehistory all the way through to the modern or the future era. So that I think most games, it's about 40,000 BC you start as. And, you know, typically one of those civilizations you can pick, I shouldn't say British, I should say English, although I think sometimes it's British, but typically it's the English civilization. Okay, the earliest human inhabitants of Great Britain and of England weren't English. So obviously you had your Neolithic, you had your Iron Age inhabitants, you had your early Celtic inhabitants. Those inhabitants were then beset upon as part of a Anglo-Saxon invasion. So that's from Germanic tribes from Northern and Central Europe. Those tribes then settled, and then they had a cultural divergence from the peoples that spawned them. There were three main Germanic tribes that invaded the British Isles. There was the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. And then as part of that Anglo-Saxon occupation of the British Isles, well, eventually those Angles, those Saxons and those Jutes formed their own culture here. And, you know, those Angles then, Anglish would then kind of mutate into English. And so you go, okay, well, great, there's your English civilization, right? But that's not all that happened. You know, then the Angles were the English were invaded by the Norse people, the Vikings. You had these huge what at the time were called heathen armies invading the British Isles, and again they invaded with intent of conquest and of colonialization. So then what happened was you had the establishment of the Danelaw, which was a Norse occupation of the British Isles, which resulted in a mixture of Norse and English culture and language into something else. And actually, a significant number of words in the English language are loan words from the Old Norse language. Okay, great. Well, you know, maybe if I'm depicting the English culture in a video game, well, then what I actually mean is it's the English Norse combination. Then you get the Normans invading. 1066, William the Conqueror, who is a displaced Norman, who is a Norman duke in northern France. The Normans, by the way, another Viking offshoot. However, they are their own civilization. And even then, they're less a civilization and more a kind of like ruling caste, but that's neither here nor there. Then they invade. And you get what I mean. Okay, so the concept of a civilization is incredibly muddy. Okay, you have groups of people who live in certain parts of the world, and they maybe have shared cultural heritages, but, you know, movements of populations, changes in demographics, political understandings, religious schisms make this incredibly messy. Some games have tried to accommodate this. I think the most notable I can think of is probably the game, but even then, that doesn't do that in a particularly comprehensive way. And there is a temptation for certain kinds of people to think of a certain people as being a immutable thing, of a fixed thing, of a is an understood truth that my people are this people and they have always been. I think Mr. Bitler would be one of those. But yeah, it's the understanding that my people are the chosen people. They've always been my people. They will always be my people. And anyone who changes or attempts to amend that is, yeah, kind of lends itself to some problematic thought, you know, some certain theories about being replaced and that sort of thing. It's games like Civilization are a significant, they're a skewed examination of history. They are a overly simplified examination of history. It is the thought that humanity is made up of a bunch of disparate peoples who don't really engage or communicate with each other outside of trade and killing each other and conquering each other and taking their cities. And that is a mode of thought that is particularly enticing and rather aligns with a certain political spectrum that is far to the right, shall we say. And that's the other thing as well, is like, okay, so there are modes of succeeding in Civilization that aren't conquest, but these again are adversarial modes of play. Is the idea that one civilization can win compared to others. A cultural victory, for example, is just a extension of soft power. You know, it's the Coke and blue jeans doctrine. You know, a religious victory of Civilization is again taking native religions and supplanting them with your own to exert soft power that way. As well as having one particular quote-unquote civilization claim ownership or custodianship over a world faith, which is something that's historically been done by certain countries. Spain did it quite a lot, for example. The concept of the defender of the faith. And you know, the grand strategy games are as guilty of this as any other games. You know, Europa Universalis is case for this. You know, if you want to get into fantastical realms, something like Total War, even Stellaris, is the concept that a civilization is in itself a political entity and a national entity, and that entity is in direct competition with other entities of its type in order to quote-unquote win. And again, if you think that your nation is the best and should be number one in the world and should quote-unquote win out over other nations or civilizations, again, I'm saying you're probably leaning to a particular end of the political spectrum. So yeah. So what do I mean by all this? do I mean that if you play and enjoy, say, a Paradox Grand strategy game or a game of Civilization, for example, you're going to turn into a crypto fascist? No, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that when you come to examine human history, when you come to examine the sum of human experiences up to this point, what makes people tick, why they do what they do, don't let thought of a game influence how you examine how people actually work, because people are not that simple. I've got footage of Hearts of Iron behind me. If it was actually a realistic depiction, I would have very little actual control over the game. You know, I'm playing as Britain here. Even in this alternate timeline behind me, Britain is still a functional democracy of a certain kind, okay? People will often act in their own self-interests or what in accordance to their own perceived creed and faith and values. And that's something that is not conducive to a player making strategic decisions to come to a set arbitrary win condition as determined by a strategy game. By all means, use historical games as a springboard to examine actual historical eras or figures or nations that you like. That's kind of what I did. But don't think that just because you played Civilization, don't think because you played Hearts of Iron and you saw a bunch of the focus trees, don't think that because you can name off the top of your head the technical specifications of a tank or a machine gun or a sword or what have you, that then equips you to speak with understanding and authority on subjects like history. I'm not gatekeeping. I'm saying examine actual academic sources, you know, even pop history to a certain extent. I mean, I would say be careful about who you're listening to. Because some people have agendas, or they're ill-informed, or they are more interested in the pop than the history part. If you want a good podcast to listen to that actually does a really good job, I would recommend the Fall of Civilizations podcast by Paul Cooper. It's an excellent podcast, by the way. I highly recommend it. But yeah, I can understand why whoever this person is on Twitter that said that games like Civilization lead to fascistic thinking. I can understand the logic, and I guess this is me imploring you. Human beings are more complicated than this, and you should do them and yourself some credit and treat the subject of history like that. Anyway, that's just my thoughts on the matter. Do you think I'm pretentious? Do you think I'm full of shit? Do you agree with everything I said? Please let me know. And yeah, I will see you on the next one. Thank you very much.